The refusal lasted only seconds, but its consequences would reach far beyond the palace walls. Queen Camilla had made a direct, calculated request concerning Princess Charlotte's place inside the newly protected royal trust. James, the Earl of Wessex, answered without a single moment of hesitation. He would not surrender control, he would not delegate parental responsibility, and he would not permit another royal hand to guide his young niece forward into her constitutional destiny. Instead, taking matters into his own hands as a senior protector of the family's immediate line, James took Charlotte beside him and personally escorted her into the institution guarding her royal future. Before we go deeper into what this dramatic confrontation really means for the survival of the modern monarchy, make sure to hit that subscription button so you do not miss a single investigative update on these unfolding palace power dynamics. Camilla had fully expected that specific morning to confirm her sweeping influence across the household, not to brutally expose its structural limits. For months, high-ranking palace officials had quietly prepared Charlotte's formal introduction to the trust without ever naming the specific person who would guide her development. That strategic silence had allowed the queen consort to firmly believe the responsibility was naturally moving toward her office. The royal trust itself, a highly protected, legal structure created to manage inherited duties, private royal assets, ceremonial obligations, and the long-term preparation for the younger family members, was far more than a mere administrative office. Entry into it would shape how the young princess understood duty, loyalty, and her permanent place beside the future crown. James understood the danger of leaving that critical role undefined. He had already quietly signed strict instructions, declaring that no outside sponsor, including the sovereign's wife, could exercise authority over Charlotte's trust position. The order was not rushed. It had been meticulously drafted, thoroughly reviewed, and legally secured before Camilla ever stepped into the corridor with the sealed folder in her hand. Camilla moved first. She approached the young princess, extended her hand, and said softly that she was ready to accompany her inside. The words sounded warm, but James heard the heavy constitutional claim beneath them. He stepped gently between the two, completely cutting off the physical trajectory, and answered with absolute finality, "I will take my niece from here." Charlotte looked from her uncle to the queen consort. Confused by the sudden, freezing stillness that followed, Charlotte felt James place one steady hand on her shoulder, offering immediate reassurance without explaining the deep political conflict unfolding above her head. Camilla slowly withdrew her own hand. Her face remained entirely controlled, yet the shock running through her team was unmistakable. She had not merely been denied a minor ceremonial privilege. She had discovered that the Earl of Wessex had anticipated her exact request and closed every single path before she could even make it. James then guided Charlotte toward the private induction chamber, where selected officials waited to begin her introduction. He never looked back. The young princess stayed close beside him, sensing that her uncle's calm carried something much harder beneath it. Camilla remained completely alone in the corridor. She tightened her grip around the sealed folder, knowing the papers inside told a completely different story, one in which she had once been promised a guiding role over the generation that will follow. But to understand why James's refusal wounded Camilla so deeply, the hidden loyalties, deep-seated fears, and private ambitions surrounding Charlotte must first be brought into the light. Behind the grand titles stood three distinct people carrying three very different structural fears. James saw a young niece who needed absolute protection before the cold weight of duty hardened around her permanently. Charlotte saw an uncle asking her to trust him without fully explaining the high-stakes chess match occurring around her. Camilla saw an unprecedented opportunity to secure her own permanent place in the monarchy's future, slipping beyond her reach. Their conflict was not merely about administrative access to a trust. It was about who would shape the young princess before the crown shaped her forever. Charlotte slowed her pace before the heavy doors of the induction chamber and looked up at James. The royal trust, that protected structure designed to prepare younger royals for inherited responsibilities, private assets, and future ceremonial duties, waited directly beyond the closed door. Yet the institution meant very little to her in that exact moment. She was thinking about the woman left behind in the corridor. In a voice barely above a whisper, the young princess asked whether Camilla was angry with them. James immediately knelt until they were face to face. He told his niece that no disagreement between adults was ever her fault, and that she had done absolutely nothing wrong. His words were gentle, but a protective gravity pressed heavily beneath them. The Earl knew his public refusal had sent a massive, shockwave message far beyond the hallway, but he would never trade Charlotte's emotional security for a temporary peace inside the palace walls. James had already watched the immense weight of destiny settle around the direct line of succession. He knew how every lesson, public appearance, and private gesture risked becoming part of an aggressive, unforgiving preparation framework. Charlotte faced a completely different danger. She was not the direct heir, but her confidence, natural discipline, and closeness to the direct line could make her one of the most influential figures of the next royal generation. That exact importance made her incredibly valuable and dangerously vulnerable to outside manipulation. Meanwhile, Camilla carried her deep humiliation into a private drawing room. She sat entirely alone, removing her formal gloves one single finger at a time, and placed them beside the sealed folder she had refused to surrender to the staff. The Queen Consort could still hear James's controlled, unyielding voice, and she could still see Charlotte watching her hand fall away into empty air. Being denied was painful. Being denied in front of the very child she hoped to guide was devastating. Camilla finally opened the folder. Inside lay an older proposal, granting her a sweeping advisory role over the ceremonial development of the younger royals. The position would have allowed her to guide their formal preparation, public conduct, and future duties. She had believed the document proved her place beside Charlotte was already universally understood. James knew otherwise. Days earlier, the Earl of Wessex had discovered through a documented palace review that the proposal had advanced through the bureaucracy without final parental or family clearance. Someone had treated their silence as absolute consent and had begun turning Charlotte's place in the trust into a direct route for long-term political influence. That discovery transformed James's concern into absolute resolve. The conflict had not begun that morning. Its true origin lay in one ceremony, one specific instruction, and one exact moment when Camilla crossed a boundary James had never publicly acknowledged. That hidden boundary had been broken weeks earlier during a closed royal rehearsal that transformed private unease into a decision James could no longer postpone. Every royal rupture has a moment that appears completely harmless until its structural meaning becomes impossible to ignore. For James, that moment came during a closed rehearsal inside the throne room. Charlotte had been invited to observe a future state ceremony, and Camilla was expected to offer simple encouragement. Instead, she issued an instruction that stunned the princess, unsettled the senior aides, and convinced the Earl of Wessex that someone else had begun planning his niece's royal identity without family permission. Charlotte had entered the rehearsal believing she was there only to learn. The session was meant to introduce her and the older children to basic ceremonial protocol, the set of formal rules governing entrances, rank, timing, and behavior during major royal occasions. James had agreed because the gathering had been described as purely educational and informal. No permanent role was supposed to be assigned, and no future duty was meant to be decided. Camilla changed that understanding with one sentence. She guided Charlotte toward a marked position on the floor and told her, "This is where you will be expected to remain when the crown carries its heaviest responsibilities." The Queen Consort spoke calmly, as though the entire decision had already been settled by a higher authority. The young princess stiffened and looked toward the doorway, searching for her uncle. Charlotte had never been told that the rehearsal would define her future. She understood the immense destiny of the line, but she had not agreed to become a permanent symbol supporting a reign before she even understood her own choices. The idea landed heavily. Her place no longer felt like part of an educational lesson. It felt like an assignment. James entered the throne room moments later and immediately sensed the freezing change in temperature. He saw his niece standing rigidly and asked the room exactly who had authorized the placement. Camilla answered that someone had to begin preparing Charlotte for the structural role awaiting her. The Earl of Wessex did not raise his voice, and that precise calm made the tension worse. A courtier then stepped forward with the preliminary ceremonial schedule. The document, an early planning paper used to assign future royal positions and duties, described Charlotte as a supporting pillar of the future reign. James read the phrase twice. He had never reviewed it. The immediate family had never approved it. Yet, the aggressive language had already begun moving through palace channels as though parental and family consent were minor details. James folded the schedule once and placed it against the table. He told every person in the room that no plan involving his niece would proceed unless it passed through her immediate family personally. Charlotte finally lowered her shoulders, but Camilla understood that the rehearsal had just become a point of no return. James acted that very evening. He ordered the trust induction rewritten so ceremonial committees and senior royal sponsors could never bypass family authority. Days later, Camilla learned that her proposed advisory role had been removed completely from the charter. She immediately demanded a private meeting before the structural change became permanent. When Camilla finally demanded an explanation, the disagreement moved out of formal documents and hidden rehearsals and into a room where neither she nor James could hide behind protocol. The meeting began with icy courtesy and ended with a line neither of them could take back. No aides were present, and no private secretary sat nearby to soften the language. Camilla entered carrying the altered trust papers, while James waited beside a table with Charlotte's induction file already open. For years, they had survived through careful, calculated distance. Now, the Earl of Wessex and the Queen Consort were forced to confront what each believed the other was trying to control. Camilla placed the revised papers on the table and kept one hand resting firmly over them. The documents covered Charlotte's trust, sponsorship, ceremonial instruction, and private advisory structure, meaning the formal arrangements deciding who could guide the young princess through future royal duties. Her name had been systematically removed from every page. James had agreed to the meeting because he wanted the dispute entirely settled before his niece entered the trust. He would not allow old resentment to follow Charlotte into a room already heavy with constitutional expectation. Camilla looked directly at him and asked, "Was I ever meant to be told?" James closed the open file with deliberate, crushing calm. "You were meant to respect the boundary," he replied. The answer struck harder than an accusation. She had expected bureaucratical resistance. She had not expected him to speak as though her role had become a threat to the family. Camilla argued that decades of service had earned her the right to help prepare the next generation. She said excluding her so completely weakened the authority of the Queen Consort, the title held by the monarch's wife, as his senior companion in royal life. James did not soften. He answered that Charlotte was not a symbol to be positioned, trained, or claimed by anyone seeking a place in the future. Camilla insisted that she had only tried to protect the princess. James leaned forward and said, "Protection begins by asking her family." Silence followed. The words stripped away every excuse surrounding the rehearsal, the schedule, and the proposal advanced without consent. Camilla pushed back her chair. She accused him of punishing her for choices made long before Charlotte was born, dragging old wounds into a decision that should have concerned duty alone. James set down his pen and told her this was not about history. It was about what she had done in the throne room and the authority she had assumed over his niece. Camilla then revealed, through their recorded private conversation, that Charles had once encouraged her to provide continuity for the younger generation if the monarchy entered a period of instability. James demanded to know whether the king had approved the trust proposal itself. She refused to answer directly. James watched her leave, then summoned the trust governor and ordered a complete review of every instruction carrying either Camilla's authority or Charles's informal approval. The argument had exposed more than personal resentment because behind Camilla's request stood an older promise, and only the king could explain how far that promise was meant to reach. The most dangerous power inside a monarchy is not always written into law. Sometimes it lives in a private assurance offered during a vulnerable moment and remembered as permanent authority. Camilla believed Charles had entrusted her with safeguarding continuity across generations. James believed no promise made by the king could override a family's control over their child. When the disputed file reached Charles, he was forced to choose between the wife beside him and the senior members of his family who would guard the monarchy's future integrity. Charles read the revised trust order entirely alone. The document set out exactly who could guide Charlotte through her formal induction, and one specific clause explicitly excluded any unauthorized royal sponsor from exercising influence over her position. The king removed his glasses and rested both hands on the desk without speaking. Years earlier, he had encouraged Camilla to help younger members of the family through difficult ceremonial transitions, especially when illness, public pressure, or uncertainty made the household unstable. But that assurance had never been constitutional. It was emotional, private, and dangerously open to interpretation. Camilla had treated that promise as established authority. She believed it gave her the right to advise the younger generation whenever the monarchy needed continuity. James saw something else. He saw a path through which his niece could be assigned a role before she even understood it, and he would not allow that path to remain open. Charles summoned the Earl of Wessex for a private conversation. He told James that Camilla's request had been intended as service, not conquest. The Earl listened, then answered with controlled, unyielding force. "Good intentions," he said, "become dangerous when they ignore consent." Charlotte was still a child. Her future could not be shaped by assumptions, even when those assumptions came from people close to the throne. Charles felt the intense pressure from both sides. Camilla had stood beside him through years of hostility, humiliation, and public rejection. James, however, was protecting his niece with the same absolute resolve the monarch once wished others had shown toward him. The conflict was no longer about loyalty alone. It was about whether love could justify authority. The trust governor then confirmed the legal position through a documented palace review. The monarch could recommend an advisor, but Charlotte's immediate family retained final control while she remained a minor. Charles understood the danger immediately. Supporting Camilla could force James to issue a formal rejection, creating a deeper and far more public humiliation for the institution. Charles chose silence over escalation. He signed a short acknowledgement naming James as Charlotte's sole family sponsor for the induction and returned Camilla's proposal without his signature. The decision was measured, but its meaning was brutal. Camilla received the rejected paper and understood at once. Charles had not merely refused to intervene, he had allowed the Earl of Wessex's authority to outrank her request in the present. With the king unwilling to intervene, the balance inside the palace shifted immediately, and Camilla was about to experience the cost of that shift in rooms where her influence had once gone unquestioned. Royal defeats are rarely announced. They appear in changed seating plans, unanswered invitations, revised instructions, and doors that no longer open at the expected moment. Within hours of Charles signing the acknowledgement, the palace machinery adjusted around James's decision. Camilla still carried her title, her household, and her place beside the king. Yet, everyone understood that on the matter of Charlotte's future, her authority had been tested, and the Earl of Wessex had prevailed. Camilla received the return proposal while taking tea in her private sitting room. She read Charles's acknowledgement once, then again, hoping the meaning might somehow change. It did not. The paper confirmed James as Charlotte's only royal sponsor, and the immediate family as the sole secondary authority over her preparation. A royal sponsor, in plain terms, was the person formally trusted to guide a younger family member through duties, inherited responsibilities, and ceremonial expectations. Her own name had disappeared completely from the documentation. Camilla lowered the untouched cup onto its saucer, but her hand trembled before it reached the table. The king had not accused her of wrongdoing. He had not publicly rejected her loyalty. That almost made the wound deeper. Charles had simply refused to defend the private promise she believed had secured her place in the monarchy's next generation. Charles entered the private sitting room moments later, quietly closing the door behind him. He told her that challenging James would have caused far greater structural damage to the family, because the Earl held absolute legally binding authority over Charlotte's trust arrangements while she remained a child. Camilla listened in cold silence before asking whether peace now meant she had to completely disappear whenever his family drew a line in the sand. The monarch tried to explain that strategic restraint was not abandonment, but she heard only the immense distance between what he had once promised in private and what he had now signed into law. The consequences of James's victory spread with devastating speed through the household bureaucracy. Trust officials immediately circulated the revised instructions, while senior courtiers were informed that every single ceremonial plan involving Charlotte required strict, written approval from her family before ever reaching an official schedule. A forthcoming youth ceremony was abruptly removed from Camilla's personal briefings. So was a highly anticipated, private historical archive session intended to teach the princess about past royal women and their public roles. James soon discovered something even more troubling through his administrative sweep. Several high-ranking courtiers had already assumed the queen consort would automatically become Charlotte's long-term mentor. What began as an informal, whispered expectation had started hardening into official palace practice behind closed doors. The Earl of Wessex ordered every single one of these assumptions corrected in writing, and directed his office to communicate with his niece's household directly, bypassing Camilla's team entirely. James had won the administrative argument, but the victory brought no immediate relief to the family. Charlotte remained visibly disturbed by the sharp corridor encounter, and her silence grew heavier as the day continued. She had watched one prominent adult withdraw in pain, and another lead her away without a clear explanation. James had secured the absolute authority he wanted, but when Charlotte finally told him what she had felt, the Earl discovered that protecting a child required far more than simply defeating an adult in a palace power struggle. The turning point did not come from the king, the trust governor, or another sealed document. It came from Charlotte herself. That evening, away from shouting secretaries and rigid ceremonial plans, she asked her uncle a question simple enough to pierce through every layer of royal strategy. Had he refused Camilla because he disliked her? Or because he believed Charlotte was truly not safe with her? James suddenly understood that his niece had absorbed the immense political tension without understanding the fierce protection behind it. Charlotte sat beside him in a private family room after finally completing the introductory trust meeting. The trust, that protected structure, designed to prepare younger royals for future duties, inherited responsibilities, and ceremonial expectations, had not frightened her. The corridor had. She could still vividly remember Camilla withdrawing her hand and her uncle leading her away without explaining the constitutional warfare that had just occurred. Charlotte finally asked whether the queen consort had done something terrible. James did not answer at once. He chose his words with extreme care because he refused to place adult wounds and palace rivalries inside his niece's mind. The Earl admitted that Camilla had crossed a major boundary by making plans without permission, but he would not call her dangerous, cruel, or unworthy of affection. James told Charlotte that his refusal had never meant she was unsafe with Camilla. It meant no one could decide how quickly she entered the unforgiving spotlight of royal life without listening to her family. And as she grew older, without listening to her, the Earl of Wessex explained that the trust was not a prison, and her role was not a destiny already written by faceless courtiers. She would be guided, but she would also be heard. Charlotte relaxed for the very first time that evening. Then, she said something that unsettled James more deeply than anger could have done. She did not want Camilla to believe she hated her. The young princess had seen human humiliation, where the adults saw institutional authority, and her natural compassion forced her uncle to confront the fine line between enforcing a necessary boundary and allowing that boundary to become a public punishment. James immediately began arranging a private, informal meeting between Charlotte and Camilla. No documents would be present, no advisors would shape the conversation, no ceremonial instruction would be given. Before his niece entered the room, the Earl looked at the queen consort and said, "She came because she wished to, not because anyone placed her here." Camilla's expression changed immediately. She understood the distinction at last. Authority had brought her absolute rejection, but Charlotte's free choice had brought her back into the room. Their conversation did not restore Camilla's advisory role, and James did not weaken the permanent protections he had created. Yet, the young princess offered kindness without surrendering her voice, creating a moment stronger than any palace order. The palace had tried its best to contain the conflict behind closed doors, but one image outside the royal trust would soon reveal both James's victory and Charlotte's unexpected grace to the entire world. By sunrise, the private refusal had become a national breaking story. Major commentators fiercely debated power, parenthood, succession, and the queen consort's rapidly shrinking influence across the household. Yet, it was not a leaked document that ultimately defined public feeling. It was a single, highly charged moment, captured outside the royal trust. James walking forward with Charlotte beside him, while the young princess turned back and offered Camilla a small, deliberate wave. In that single gesture, the country saw absolute firmness without hatred and distance without humiliation. Palace correspondents moved with incredible speed. They learned through an official high-level briefing that the Earl of Wessex had personally sponsored Charlotte's induction after systematically rejecting Camilla's request to escort and advise her. The trust induction, the formal process introducing a younger royal to future duties, inherited responsibilities, and protected family obligations had suddenly become far more than a private ceremony. It now represented a high-stakes, public battle over who held the fundamental right to shape the next generation. The palace released a highly restrained, carefully worded statement confirming that the immediate family remained entirely responsible for decisions involving their children's preparation and welfare. James refused to add anything more to the press. His absolute silence carried its own powerful message. He would not turn his niece's protection into a personal victory speech. A major morning newspaper captured the moment with brutal simplicity. Its front page showed James and Charlotte entering the trust building beneath the sweeping headline, "Her family, her future," while Camilla appeared several steps behind them in the frame. The image spread rapidly across global media networks, and the physical distance between them became an undeniable symbol of the deeper structural separation inside the royal family. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered near the gates. One onlooker held a handwritten sign reading, "Let Charlotte choose." Others quietly agreed, seeing the Earl's decision not as an act of casual rebellion, but as a senior family member refusing to let rigid palace hierarchy override the emotional and psychological needs of a child. A prominent national broadcaster described the entire episode as the clearest sign yet that James would protect the younger generation from becoming mere functional pieces in an inherited palace system. That specific framing wounded Camilla deeply. She watched the wall-to-wall news coverage beside Charles and heard political commentators openly suggest that she had tried to seize unilateral control of the princess's future. The king quietly admitted that the public image could no longer be reversed by the press office. Then, the broadcast footage changed everything. Charlotte's small wave toward Camilla completely softened the harsher edges of the media story. Viewers saw that James had enforced a necessary boundary without teaching bitterness, while the young princess had offered genuine kindness without surrendering her voice. James declined every single request for a triumphant response from the newspapers. Instead, he instructed his administrative office to focus entirely on Charlotte's successful induction rather than Camilla's public exclusion. The victory, he firmly believed, belonged to his niece's freedom, not his own personal authority. The country had chosen its symbol, but the final verdict would be written inside the private rooms of the family, where James, Camilla, Charles, and Charlotte ultimately confronted what authority could protect and what it could never repair. In the end, James's refusal was not remembered as a calculated defeat of a queen or as another destructive fracture inside a troubled royal household. It became something far more important, a historic declaration that Charlotte's future would never be negotiated between powerful adults behind closed doors. While she stood silently nearby during the process, Camilla permanently lost the sweeping authority she had requested. James accepted every consequence of denying her. Charles chose not to interfere, and Charlotte emerged not as the passive object of their struggle, but as the very person whose quiet dignity finally settled it. James watched the final, official trust record being placed before him on the desk and fully understood the immense weight of what had changed. The royal trust, that protected structure guiding inherited responsibilities, private assets, and future ceremonial duties, now officially named him as Charlotte's primary sponsor, with the immediate family holding sole parental authority. More importantly, the legal document now explicitly required the young princess's own consent to carry increasing weight as she grew older. Camilla's proposed advisory position was permanently and legally withdrawn from the charter, ending every past assumption that she would direct the child's ceremonial development. Charles brought James and Camilla together one final time in his private study. The king told them that the family could not instantly erase the emotional hurt, but the structural boundary had to be accepted without another challenge. Camilla listened in silence, then admitted that she had mistaken past confidence in her for unrestricted permission. The queen consort remained deeply wounded, yet she agreed never again to pursue authority over Charlotte's path. James acknowledged that his manner in the corridor had been severe. He refused, however, to apologize for the decision itself. The Earl made it entirely clear that family protection, not rank or protocol, had guided his actions. Charles accepted that preserving his marriage could never require weakening his family's duty or damaging the fundamental trust of the next generation. Charlotte entered the study after the adults had finished speaking. She carried a small, handwritten note and gave it directly to Camilla. The young princess thanked her for caring, but gently explained in her own words that she wanted her immediate family beside her. While she learned what royal life would demand, she did not reject affection. She simply claimed the right to choose exactly how that affection entered her future. Camilla read the note in complete silence. Then, She embraced Charlotte without any further ceremony and finally understood what the struggle had revealed. Affection freely offered meant far more than influence formally granted. James's action established an entirely new royal principle. Younger family members would not merely inherit expectations. They would be protected, consulted, and allowed to grow into duty instead of being forced beneath it. The refusal did not destroy the family, it clarified it. Camilla remained queen consort. Charles remained her husband. James and 19 her senior protector of the line, but Charlotte was no longer treated as territory between them. James entered the royal trust holding Charlotte's hand. And when they emerged, the future was entirely theirs.